Well, one of the most interesting things that I've just experienced was returning from Iran, in which I was one of the commentators and speakers at the New Horizon conference, sponsored by Nader Talzabada. And it was a wonderful conference in which we journeyed to Iran and to Mashhad and Tehran and briefed the Iranian media, the Iranian diplomats, the Iranian universities, the Iranian intelligence officials on things that were pertaining to world policy, specifically the JCPOA, the United States Embassy move to Jerusalem. All of these things were on the forefront of the Iranian mind, and we went to Iran to develop a dialogue, to engage in alternative diplomacy. And myself, along with about 20 other former diplomats, intelligence officials, former military, media journalists from around the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other Western nations in particular, we were able to go over to Iran, engage in conversations and analysis that is sorely missing from around the world, and is sorely missing from the United States diplomatic corps. So what we had achieved essentially was communicating to the Iranian people that, number one, the American people do not want war, the Iranian people do not want war, and therefore it is in our best interest to develop alternative diplomatic missions and discussions and talking points and conferences where we can get together and have the best and brightest people exchange ideas and provide honest plans and solutions for navigating our way out of these problems. And some of the ideas involved developing a very strong legal defense that Iran could take to the New York courts and challenge the 9/11 accusations and legal case that was put against Iran, in which $6 billion was the judgment against Iran. We explored legal defenses for that. We explored the opportunity of bringing in newly discovered evidence from witnesses and materials to benefit Iran, expert witnesses that could be brought in on behalf of Iran to disprove not only Iran's complete innocence from having anything to do with 9/11, but at the same time expose the 9/11 attacks as completely fraudulent, completely artificial, and in fact one of the greatest deception operations against the world in the history of civilization. And some of the people that we were going to be bringing into New York include Dr. James Fetzer, Dr. Kevin Barrett, Barbara Honegger, Alan Zabrowski, Richard Gage, myself, and many, many others who have been researchers in avionics and metallurgy and physical sciences, who have been personally experienced at the Pentagon, in the World Trade Center Tower, in Building 7, in Pennsylvania. All of these facts can be brought to bear to provide the Iranian legal team with every piece of evidence, every document, every testimony that it requires to not only expunge its name and vindicate itself, but to liberate the American people and the European people from this tyranny, this psychological operation which has put the world into such fear for the past 18 years. So what we're looking forward to is not only a great day in court, but really the liberation of Western civilization from this great fraud. And it will also simultaneously show that the Zionist Israeli Mossad Likud party that was so involved in 9/11 really demonstrates it is one of the greatest enemies of the United States and not an ally. And we also discussed increasing Iranian-Russian relationships at the FIFA World Cup, in which Russia and Iran share a team activity, a game perhaps, sharing the Russian-Iranian players against the United States and United Kingdom players, anything to promote the idea that Russia and Iran represent a new stability in the Middle East, and that those opposing Russia and Iran represent instability, chaos, and bloodshed. And this is really a public relations information operation designed to win the hearts and minds of the European people, and also the Eastern European former Soviet countries, so that those countries will see that the next paradigm shift of political rule is going to engage Russia, the former Soviet countries, Scandinavia, Scotland, in a Celtic, Nordic, Slavic alliance, which will naturally have an economic junction with China and Iran. And from that, you will have the next century of peace and stability, and the U.S. will be increasingly either humbled into a position of stability itself, where this hegemonic crusade is abandoned, or it will be disintegrated under the weight of its own police state.
Thank you very much.
Let's speak to Scott Bennett. He's a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer, and he joins us via Skype from San Francisco. Hey, thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Bennett. Now, first of all, I'd like to get your opinion as far as this approach goes vis-a-vis Iran from the U.S. Is it one that will foster stability in the Middle East?
No, of course not. I think it's a vain attempt to be bullying and be using overt pressure on Iran to try and bring it to some sort of a negotiation table in the hopes that it will surrender its sovereignty and bow to all of the demands that Pompeo and the Trump administration are foolishly trying to pursue. It's not going to work. It's going to fail, and every country in Europe and Russia realizes that, and they've said it again and again. It's very sad to witness this mental breakdown in American foreign policy, and that's the only way to describe it, because there's no reality, there's no logic, there's no reason, except if you're trying to foment conditions for a war, for a military intervention. But even that is going to fail, because not a single American wants to go to war with Iran. I was in Iran last week with the New Horizons conference, and I was with many colleagues in the former State Department, Pentagon, CIA, and we all are in firm agreement that Iran is not an enemy of the United States, and that this reckless policy of JCPOA renegotiation, as well as the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem, all of these are very incendiary and pointless policies that can do no good to the American people or their interests. So they're not going to really be able to exercise any control or pressure on Iran. This is an attempt to sort of bully them, but I think with Russia entering the conversation and Iran standing its ground and an aggressive public relations campaign out to the European nations, there really won't be any change, other than the U.S. is going to have to change when it realizes its negotiation tactics are failing.
Right, but Mr. Bennett, at the same time, what we're seeing is U.S. adopting a policy of both sanctions and also trying to garner some form of support around the world for its policy when it comes to Iran, be it by creating this quote-unquote what it described as an international coalition against Iran, or other such maneuvers. Do you think it's going to work?
Well, I don't. I think it's a psychological warfare, of course. They're waging sanctions, they're waging pressure, they're trying to develop conditions that could define Iran as a threat, and it's not a threat. However, we discussed this at length when I was in Iran last week with various people in the Iranian government and universities. We said one card that Iran can play that will really change the entire information dynamic is re-engaging the 9/11 issue and the charges that were brought against Iran. Iran is the only country on planet Earth that can really enter the courts of the American court system and say this 9/11 attack that you accused Iran of doing is completely false. We have all the evidence and the intelligence that will disprove it, and we will liberate the American people from the greatest brainwashing since the beginning of civilization, and the people of Europe. It's very ironic, but Iran is in a position to have enormous impact on the American public by revealing in a court setting the disgraceful lies that started these wars in 2001, by inadvertently accusing Iran of having a 9/11 connection They've allowed Iran to enter the courts and enter discovery and bring in expert witnesses such as myself, such as James Fetzer, such as about 25 different experts and researchers to be witnesses to testify about the truth of 9/11. And Iran not only would be exonerated, it would be championed as the leading voice of truth regarding 9/11. And that will have staggering impacts on the American mind, and that will put to flight, I think, this Zionist agenda of trying to constantly define Iran as the enemy of the American people. Russia knows that, Europe knows that, Iran knows that. The American people are the only ones that are in the dark about 9/11. So I think we have to really look at this as if the United States under Pompeo and Trump and these other Nikki Haley types are going to constantly be trying to wage information war against Iran, slander it, lie about it, accuse it of all sorts of nonsense, then Iran needs to combat that with truth. There's an old saying, the truth yelled out will always destroy lies and liars, and we know the truth is on Iran's side. There is no missile engagements that they're deploying against the United States or Europe. They are developing their own defensive weapons so that Israel cannot engage in any strikes, and every nation is entitled to that. But Iran has also not waged any aggressive war against anyone since 1775. It has defended itself against the American mercenaries such as Iraq and Saddam Hussein. It's also defended itself against the chemical weapons that the United States provided to Saddam Hussein to wage against Iran. I know that for a fact, and I was briefed, and I briefed other people about it. So we see Iran really, I think, strengthening and consolidating its firmness and its openness in the community of nations. The only thing Iran needs to do is constantly maintain a dialogue with the United States. It cannot be provoked into a military conflict, and it cannot be isolated into silence. Iran needs to constantly be extending the hand of dialogue and communication, because that is a form of aggressive, offensive warfare, if you will. By dialoguing and communicating, you occupy a higher position, and the truth ultimately wins out in all negotiations.
All right, that's Scott Bennett, former U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Officer, joining us via Skype from San Francisco. Mr. Bennett, thanks very much indeed for sharing your thoughts here on Press TV.
Welcome back. Let's continue with the second part of this news edition. U.S. political activists have urged Iran to appeal a New York court ruling that orders Tehran to pay a massive amount of money to the victims of the September 11th attacks. In a letter to the Iranian government, some 40 activists said that they are ready to give court testimony in support of Iran's innocence. Well, they said that the case is, quote, extremely weak, and Iran will likely win if it chooses to defend itself. The signatories to the letter are prominent critics of the official narrative about the 2001 attacks. In April, the Southern District Court of New York issued a verdict based on which Iran must pay more than $6 billion to the 9/11 victims. Iran has rejected the ruling as politically motivated. The attacks were carried out by 19 skyjackers, 15 of whom were Saudis, and the rest were from 3 Arab countries of the Middle East region. Now let's get some insight from Ontario. I'm now joined by Graham McQueen, scholar and political commentator. Good to have you with us, sir. I mean, shouldn't they look for the culprits of the 9/11 attacks elsewhere, given the fact that they were from Arab countries, especially from Saudi Arabia? What has Iran got to do with this?
Well, I agree. What does Iran have to do with it? Not only should they look elsewhere, though, they should look deeply. The point of this letter, at least from my point of view as a person signing it, an individual signing it, is to draw attention to the evidence collected now over more than 15 years by researchers, which shows that the U.S. official narrative of 9/11 is false. It's not about speculation. It's not about how I feel or what my intuition says or some vague sense of unfairness. It's that I'm convinced that we can prove, we have already proved, that the U.S. official story of 9/11 is false. And that's the story about the 19 Islamic extremists and so on. And whether you choose the version of that story according to which they did it on their own, or whether you manipulate that story and say they did it with Iran's backing, either of those stories is absurdly off track, and we can show it. So the point of the letter is to say, yes, we realize it's the Iranian government's responsibility to decide how to respond to these charges, and they may very well decide we can't trust the U.S. courts, it's too dangerous to directly confront the U.S. I get that. I understand that. That's their decision. But my responsibility as an individual researcher is to say to the government of Iran and the people of Iran, look please at the research we have done, and you'll see that this is not a matter of opinion. This is very solid, copious evidence, and how you make use of it is up to you. But if you do choose to appeal the decision and to challenge the U.S. narrative, you'll have a lot of evidence on your side.
Yeah, could you also elaborate on that? If Iran chooses to do that, what do you think will happen?
Well, I'm not going to speculate about that, because that's the job of the Iranian government to think now, what could we win and what could we lose if we challenge this? It's a very dangerous government right now, the United States government. I understand that. You don't want to provoke them. I get that. But again, what's my responsibility? When I look at this, I look at the whole world, not Iran and the United States, and I say, what are the implications for the world if nobody ever challenges, in court and outside of court, this faulty and this fraudulent narrative of 9/11. Look at the wars, look at the massive killings that have been done on the basis of that false narrative. Who is going to stand up and challenge it? And of course we know that former President Ahmadinejad did challenge it in the United Nations. And we know that other former state leaders and existing state leaders, not very many of them, but a few of them, have also challenged that story, including Mahathir in Malaysia, and including the former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. So there are a few leaders who've had both the brains and the courage to stand up and say there's something deeply wrong with this explanation. And now the Iranian government, it seems to me, has that decision to make. Should we continue in the Ahmadinejad mode, or should we say, well, you know, maybe that's too dangerous to directly confront them? That's not my decision.
All right. Thank you for your thoughts. That was Graham McQueen from Ontario, who is a scholar and political commentator, joining us.